Hello, and welcome to this Nature Research Custom Media webcast titled Improving Lab Efficiency, a look at Boston University's digital transformation. Build-out of an automated high-throughput CLIA lab for SARS-CoV-2 testing on a large urban campus. My name is Nikki Forrester, and I will be your moderator. Today's webcast is produced by eLab Next. COVID-19 has transformed our world. When the first cases in the United States were detected in early 2020, people went into lockdown and implemented a variety of safety precautions. As pandemic restrictions began to ease, the demand for COVID-19 testing skyrocketed. These tests were often costly, difficult to obtain, or had long turnaround times. Some academic institutions, including Boston University, created an on-campus COVID-19 screening protocol to help students, faculty, and staff safely return to campus with the option for in-person classes. BU built an automated high-throughput facility on campus with the capacity to run 45,000 individual tests weekly with a purpose-built CLIA laboratory, a multiplex reverse transcription PCR test, robotic instrumentation, and trained staff. The BU Clinical Testing Laboratory was operational at the start of fall 2020 and performed over 1 million SARS-CoV-2 PCR tests during the 2020-2021 academic year. This webcast will present the practical benefits of adopting digital technologies in an automated high-throughput lab environment and share how BU researchers were able to streamline their workflows, manage their data, and effectively collaborate with their colleagues. We'll begin the webcast with presentations from Sarah Zurabayan from eLab Next and Lena Landaverde from DAMP Lab and the BU Clinical Testing Lab. We'll end the webcast with a Q&A. Joining us for the Q&A today are Sherry Hoovel from Boston University and Dr. Lynn Doucet-Stam from the BU Clinical Testing Laboratory. To ask a question, just type it in where it says Ask a Question and then press Submit at any point during the webcast. We'll do our best to answer all of your questions today. And now over to Zara and Lena.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. And today we will be discussing how to drive digital transformation in your lab. And today, one of the presenters that will be joining us is from Boston University. So we're very happy to showcase this case study, a success story of how to transition your lab into the digital age. So what is the problem in today's world when it comes to a digital transformation? The problem is that we have a lot of one-trick ponies out there that can provide you with a great solution for one aspect of the lab, but they cannot provide a holistic solution that allows you to connect all of the different operations within the lab, whether it be the data from your instruments, whether it be connecting to another database that is storing some of your important sample data, journal data. So we kind of look at this ecosystem of the lab. We try to understand, okay, what are these problems in the lab? And we try to provide a solution for that allows you to connect everything together. This connectivity between your data allows you to be more future ready. It's allowing you to have more connectivity, scalability, and flexibility in being able to integrate, access your data, and be able to analyze that data when the time comes. So as we are looking into this digital transformation, it's important to note that we're kind of going towards data connectivity. That is the end goal. And you do that by having data integrity and building a sustainable digital health. And there are some key pillars for that. It's important for us to prime this webinar with. One of them is accessibility. And accessibility is not just about accessing data remotely when you're working from home, which was, a very important part during the pandemic. But it's about accessing very specific sets of data. So for example, if you are managing 10,000 samples a day, those 10,000 samples, each one of them have 50 metadata fields. Each one of these fields have other files that are attached to it, which have their own metadata fields. This is a deep data lake. This is these are millions of data points. So the question becomes, how do you parse through all of that noise and get to the very specific sets of information that's needed for your lab, for the particular PI, for the particular scientist, or for that particular lab tech that is trying to run some of the operational aspects of it? The other component of lab digitization is efficiency. So, Excel, EndNote, these are all great ways for you to digitize your lab, but is that really making you more efficient? So the question here is, are you decentralizing your data across different platforms, or are you centralizing everything in one place so you spend less time doing administrative work looking for things, and you actually spend more time doing your lab work, doing more research, processing samples, and so on. So automation is key in this journey towards lab digitization in order for you to be more efficient. The other component is security and compliance. So whether you're working with patient data and you need to be PHI compliant, whether you're working with HIPAA guidelines, GXP guidelines, FDA guidelines, these are all important elements of making sure that you have a strong foundation before you go on this journey towards lab digitization. The other pillar, which is relatively new, and I'm sure many of you have been playing around with ChatGPT. I know I have. So this is more prevalent these days. But 5 years ago, data analysis was not really part of the lab digitization discussion. But recently, we have noticed that labs want to be able to analyze their data right on the spot, instead of collecting all of this information, then sending it to a CRO that will analyze the data, or hiring a bunch of data scientists and packaging all of this information and sending it over to them to analyze this data. People want to be able to do this on the spot in order to know which direction their lab is going into. If you are more advanced in some of your digital solutions, then you can actually apply machine learning and do predictive learning and try to understand how this is actually going to look 1 year from now based on what you've collected so far. So this has been a very fun addition to this overall discussion. And I'm glad that we're able to provide some of these solutions. And lastly, it is instrument monitoring and connectivity. Now, this is a loaded word because, when you say, I would like to connect my instrument to a digital platform, now, what does that mean? It can mean a range of different things. This could mean, managing the temperature and the humidity of your freezers or your incubators. This could also mean that PCR, that HPLC, that mass spec, whatever it is that is generating files, being able to sync that automatically into your digital platform. But it could also mean all the way to being able to control your robots directly from a digital lab platform, being able to push and pull data back and forth between these files and these instruments. And all of these things are being done thanks to having an open API, an SDK. SDK stands for Software Development Kit, and being able to create these additional integrations as needed for each lab. Because obviously you cannot have all of the integrations and all of the connectivities to every single instrument that's out there, but you can have the capability to do that. And then depending on the workflow of the lab, be able to make these connections. So these are the pillars of lab digitization, I hope this gives you a bit of more insight as to what this webinar is going to be about as we progress. So I hope this slides puts a smile on your face. If you look at the person on the top left, this is the person that we want to be in the lab, right? When I was doing research, I wish my freezer looked this organized. But of course, this is not just about your sample management and freezer management. This is about your overall data management in the lab. We've all seen that file that has V1, V2, V3, final, dash, final, final, the real final. I mean, these are things that we've all seen in the lab, and it's not our fault that we do that. The real reason is because we just haven't had the tools available for us in order for us to be organized and standardized. And because of that, we end up being the person on the bottom right. Of course, this doesn't happen with you if you're listening in, but I'm sure you've come across this in the lab. And this is where we come in with eLab Next, and we say, okay, we're here to provide you with a vision, a sample strategy, a digital strategy right from the beginning in order to help you become more organized, standardized within the lab. So there are various challenges along the experiment process, the sample process in the lab, and they're all interconnected. And these are some of the questions that we try to find answers to. And I do not want to read all of these questions to you one by one, but one thing that I want to point out is that when you are going on this digital transformation journey, it's important to not only look at the short-term goals, but it's extremely important to look at the long-term goals. Now, what do I mean by that? For short term, you know that you need to, let's say, label your samples, and you need to know where the samples are, and you need to track the life of the sample, meaning how it comes into the lab, how it gets analyzed, how the data gets uploaded into a digital platform. And some of us, we kind of stop there. But the question here is that what is the impact that this particular experimental design having on your overall business strategy, your research and development strategy? How is that going to impact your organization, not just for today and tomorrow, but 3 years from now, 5 years from now? To give you an example of this, we hardly talk about, let's say, energy consumption in the lab. Well, if you have designed a good digital strategy and a sample strategy in the lab, and you know where things are, you know exactly how things are being tracked, you are opening and closing the freezer doors less. And that's having a huge impact on the overall energy consumption, and you become more green and you become more sustainable. So that's just one of the examples of thinking the trickle down effect of having a proper digital strategy within your organization. Another example of this would be, keeping track of your the temperature of your freezers, or keeping track of the experimental design as far as who is utilizing certain instruments, how are these data that the instruments are generating being uploaded into a digital platform, who does the analysis of these things. All of that can be easily designed and easily executed. The question here is that who is leading this within your organization? And do you have someone that you can trust from the other side, from the vendor side, that can guide you in that process so you can build a sustainable ecosystem for your organization? Because if you don't, that costs a lot of time, money, and anxiety. So sometimes we don't think about that either. We just power through it. But really, I'm here to say that it's very doable, and this transition can be a very smooth one and a very easy one. And that's what this slide says. This is a tangible dream. Whether you are working with a couple of hundred samples a day or a week, or you are a lab that's managing 10 or 20,000 samples a day, whether you're starting out now, or if you are a lab that has been biobanking thousands of samples for the past 30 years, whatever the case is, we have a lot of experience with helping you to transition into a digital ecosystem. And today, you will actually hear the success story from Boston University that was managing about 10,000 samples a day. We'll wait until we get there, but I just want to give people a peace of mind that this is indeed a very tangible dream. So to give you guys more context, let's look at the history of how we kind of transitioned into this digital world. So we had the cable landline. Of course, maybe some of you have used this. I know I have back home. And we've had physical notebooks, and this is where we kept track of all of our experimental design, our sample tracking, and this is as old as science, right? So we've all seen this. Then in the 1990s, this is when we transitioned into the digital age. We've had mobile phones, we started having laptops, and this is when we started seeing the very first electronic lab notebooks and LIMS systems and sample management systems. This was a great revolution towards this lab digitization that has helped thousands of labs worldwide. But now the question here is, from my very first slide, was, is that helping you to stay connected with everything else that you are doing in the lab, or is it not? And this is where we came into place, and we saw the smartphone being established in 2007, where you have a marketplace that you can go in, an app store, and download all of your favorite apps, right? You no longer need your GPS Garmin. You can just download the app or use the map that the phone comes with in order for you to go through the city. And so we noticed that this is the correct direction forward in order to create a future-proof digital ecosystem. And we did the same thing on the lab side, and we created a lab operating system, a digital lab platform that allows you to not only use the core products of a digital solution, but then be able to integrate your favorite or maybe not so favorite, but needed other solutions into the platform, so then you can stay connected within the lab with everything else that's going on. Whether it's the molecular biology department, the chemistry department, maybe you have some kind of a project with the local hospital and you need to connect to their database and push and pull data back and forth. This is the ideal ecosystem for a lab, to know that that somebody has got their back, and they will not silo and they will not decentralize their data by having a one-dimensional solution. So this is what we had presented to Boston University before they move forward with their needs and their solutions. So essentially, just to give you guys more insight as to what these products are that we're speaking of. So eLab Next is really the brand, and then the three main modules within that is eLab Journal, which is an all-in-one digital lab, electronic lab notebook, which has components of these other sub modules, eLab Inventory, which is your kind of standard LIMS-like sample management, equipment management, supply management platform. And then there's the eLab Protocols, which is for your SOP management, standard operating procedures. So this ecosystem is something that you can kind of pick and choose these different modules and utilize them as needed. So again, what we're trying to get at is a connected lab. This is the end goal of any lab, is to stay connected and not decentralize your information. So this was a key pain point for Boston University's COVID lab. And when they presented us with their needs, we tried to have a solution for them that will allow them to connect to everything else that they're using in the lab. So to give you guys more insight on that, when we were creating this connected lab, we wanted to make sure that we facilitate an efficient and comprehensive research data within the lab. And the research data that consists of sample data, and that consists of data that you get from devices. And it's important that during this digital transformation that the people that you're working with, they're very focused on providing you with a solution on a continuous basis. So, for example, a centrifuge, you learn how to use it, and then that's it. It ends there. But when it comes to a digital transformation that has multiple updates happening all the time, it is extremely important to have an ongoing relationship where you're constantly training, you're constantly speaking of all the different elements and trying to optimize the workflow, especially if the workflow in the lab is subject to change. So to give you guys more visual insight into this, we basically provided a digital lab platform that is built on your core data models, provides you with data storage, provides you with an overall digital strategy, growth strategy, a marketplace where you can tap into these other add-ons that you might want to use. And this is being done with the thanks of the API, which allows you to do data exchange between software and, of course, the SDK, the software development kit. And one side of this is you're able to apply the eLab Next apps into your day-to-day workflow, and for other elements, you are able to do that with the thanks of API and SDK, and then be able to connect to all of these other add-ons that you might want to be able to use. And in this case, Boston University needed to have access to point and click, needed access to enterprise health. They needed HL7 integration. They needed a connection to the Hamilton robots in order to push and pull data back and forth. And these are the things that we customized together as a team in this collaborative effort to provide an ecosystem that they can leverage in order to manage their samples and their workflow in the lab. So without further ado, I'd like to pass this on to Lena. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, C, for that awesome slide deck and also the transition. I'm going to be talking about Boston University and specifically the building of the BU Clinical Testing Lab from the ground up. We had to integrate a digital platform with automated high-throughput clinical testing lab. When the pandemic started in 2020, the university, specifically Boston University, had to be remote starting spring break. And if you look here, Boston University is quite a large university. We cover quite a bit of space in Boston itself. The population of the university is 35,000 students and 10,000 employees. The campus is integrated in multiple ways with the city of Boston. And what we realized very quickly at BU was that we needed to figure out what the health and safety initiatives were going to be if we wanted to open back up in fall of 2020. So for back to BU in fall of 2020, there were a couple initiatives that had started. Outside of putting together the clinical testing lab, BU had to develop multiple aspects of the campus to be able to make it safe for individuals to get back. So we have the Learn from Anywhere hybrid learning format and new on-campus protocols. The Learn from Anywhere allowed students to be on campus and also online to be able to start school safely in fall of 2020. And the development team for the clinical testing lab that allowed individuals back on campus was between two groups, the Precision Diagnostic Center and the DAMP Lab. The Precision Diagnostic Center is led by Catherine Clapperidge, and the DAMP Lab is led by Doug Dunsmore. Including these two groups, there were huge efforts on campus, which involved a leadership team with 15 individuals from different departments within BU that included facilities, housing, and student health and employee health, just to work together to find the solution. Now I'm going to just talk a little bit more about the clinical testing lab because that's what this presentation is about. We wanted to be able to scale up PCR testing for individuals on campus. We needed it to be a high throughput testing because of how large the university was. we wanted to provide next day results, which was not easily accessible at that time. And the test itself is a EUA approved test. If you see here on the slide deck, we have an example of some of the materials that was available on campus to provide instruction and kind of guide people on how to do some of the testing. So here, I think a lot of folks are familiar with these steps now. It's COVID-19 testing and how to process these samples in the lab. So at the time, people were transitioning from NP swabs to AN swabs, and the testing collection was done by the individuals themselves in different aspects. So a lot of it was done in a monitored way in the sample collection site. The samples have to be processed with RNA extraction and purification. And then once those steps are completed, they are tested using qPCR. And the results would allow you to determine if this individual had COVID-19 or not. And part of this, as you can see here, is we have to be able to track all of these individual steps. And just thinking about all of these things in a small scale before scaling up. Here we see this diagram, and it's kind of complicated. There's quite a few steps and quite a few parts if you look at this. The goal is to not look at them individually, but rather just to take in and understand that this wasn't an easy task. There was a lot of steps required to put it together. What we're going to focus on in this talk is the digital lab platform aspect, which needed to be compatible with a multitude of things in the testing lab as well as outside of the testing lab. This had to include the sample collection sites, specifically the electric medical records, the EMR systems, all had to be able to communicate with the clinical testing lab, which had to track all of the individual samples. So just briefly going over our timeline, we had to ramp up very quickly to get this up and running. So in May, the PDC and the DAMP, which I had introduced earlier, collaborated to create a proposal to build the clinical testing lab. In June, most of our robotics had arrived. We went with the Hamilton automation devices. So these are the robots you're seeing being set up in this quick video. In July, we had to do our EUA validation studies, as well as setting up our BMC, which is the Boston Medical Center pilot study, to ensure that our process from start to finish was streamlined and the workflow was possible to scale up in the way that we did. In August, the staff was hired for the clinical testing lab. This is approximately 30 or so individuals who had to be onboarded very quickly to be able to run all of these stations effectively, accurately, and efficiently. Lastly, in September, which is fall of 2020, the testing program went live for Boston University. Over here, we're going to look at the overview of the automation infrastructure. So the key things to note here is there are some manual steps and some automated steps in the clinical testing lab. The manual steps included the sample collection sites, which involved individuals collecting their samples while an individual was monitoring them to ensure the samples were collected properly. Then there was accession and inactivation step, which is done within the clinical testing lab after the samples are received. Then the automated steps took all of the steps we had talked earlier and was able to scale that up and also make it efficient for us to process so many samples. So there's a sample aliquoting, RNA extraction, qPCR preparation, and qPCR. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the space and also each of those individual steps I had just described. When we put together the lab, we had to consider the efficiency of the space and also the individual steps and how we were going to segment the lab so we could have all of the appropriate considerations when it comes to wet lab. So in station 1, it was the manual and sample receiving station. So samples were received in the clinical testing lab. These samples were accepted and scanned into the system. Then once that was completed, samples were inactivated in the biosafety cabinets before they were moved on to the first automation instrument. So this automation instrument in station 2 is where samples were moved from tubes into plates. These plates are then processed in steps 3, In 3, we include both automated extraction and qPCR plate preparation, which are 2 critical steps that go back to back and scale up all of the sample testing from station 1. Lastly, in station 4, all of the extracted samples that are prepped on qPCR plates are then taken to the qPCR station for processing and finally data analysis. So we just saw how many steps are required for processing these samples, but what does it mean in terms of how much data we're processing? So if you look at this slide, the 2 key things here are the order sent to CTL and results sent to the EMR. So if you look at that, those are samples that are collected at the collection site, and so the orders are sent to the clinical testing lab. And at the very end, the results from the lab are sent to the EMRs so that individuals can get their final results. In between is everything we just discussed. So we have the intake of the samples, the aliquoting of the samples, RNA extraction, qPCR prep, and also the the qPCR itself. So all of those steps produce a large set of data because we want to be able to track every single step. So we want to know where the samples are in this process, which samples are they, because they're all individually barcoded. Also, we want to be able to say what reagents were used. There was a lot of considerations in how much data. So to give you just a rough estimate, each sample has approximately 55 data points, and these data points are tracked entirely through this whole process. So we really needed a robust digital lab platform to be able to capture all of this for us. So looking at this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the eLab application architecture. So in this left box, or my left, is eLab Next. So eLab Next communicates with the lab technicians, the lab managers, and the instruments themselves. Lab techs and lab managers are able to access all the information from eLab Next using a single sign-on, and they're able to do it from any laptop or PC in the clinical testing lab. And this is because it's a web-based browser, so we are able to easily access our data and also process that information and do searches as needed within the clinical testing lab. Then there's the lab equipment aspect of it. Each of the robotics, including the qPCR machines, are able to process and communicate all of the information captured on that instrument to eLab Next. So as you see here, this is already one point of integration that we were able to do using this digital lab platform. Next, eLab Next was able to integrate with multiple platforms. Z had touched on this briefly at the very end of his presentation, where he talked about different kinds of platforms that we had planned to use in the clinical testing lab, and eLab Next had solutions for that. So here are 2 examples. We have the EMR systems from employee health and the EMRs for students. So those are 2 different systems that are able to integrate with eLab Next. So moving to the next slide, this one is the sample journey and captured data. So I have discussed overall how much data is captured in the whole system to be able to track individual samples, but this just gives you a visual for what that data looks like. So if you start from the very left of this slide, you track a single sample. That single sample is then mapped to a well plate location. So each well is an individual sample, and these plates are mapped 1-to-1 between aliquoting and extraction. And once it gets to qPCR prep, all 4 plates are mapped to one single plate. So we're able to track the location of these samples using digital means, which really reduces the amount of possible confusion and errors made in the clinical testing lab. This slide will highlight all of the individual aspects we were able to leverage using a digital lab platform. It really centralizes all of our data and makes it really easy for all of us to access information within our workflows, especially since there's so many steps being taken while we process our samples. So in this first line, it's completely digital. We really wanted a solution that didn't involve stacks and stacks of paper. There was just really no good way for, as you can imagine, for us to scale up to test so many samples. And I guess I haven't mentioned this yet, but we were aiming for 5,000 samples per day. So just imagine trying to track 5,000 samples and over 55 fields of data per sample. It just wouldn't be possible without a digital solution. Then we wanted something that was easy to access. So eLab Next is actually a web-based platform, which means that any browser can open eLab Next and you can process your samples or look up data from there. This is important, especially in the manual steps of accepting the samples in the clinical testing lab, because we could have multiple stations easily using actually the QR codes listed here to process samples into the clinical testing lab without having to key in any information manually. The multi-platform integration, we had a slide on that, which was discussing how eLab Next was able to communicate with different platforms, specifically the EMR systems, because we have 2 different ones on campus. Then for customizable sample fields, those 55 sample fields, they're all custom for us. So we were able to determine what sample fields we were interested in capturing in the clinical testing lab, and all of those are you're able to change that on your own in eLab Next. In addition to that, what's important is that once we had to do pooling, which didn't happen until later on, we were able to modify these sample fields and also create new sample types that can allow us to have parent samples to individual samples so that we had a pooling tracking system. For unique to user QR codes, this was something that we hadn't anticipated using until we asked eLab Next. We need to quickly process all of these samples. What's a good way to do it? So there's a way in this platform where you can create custom QR codes that perform multiple actions in the system, the digital platform. And you're able to, for example, scan multiple barcode tubes into eLab Next at once, so we can say they're all received. And or we were able to use a custom solution where we were able to assign multiple individual tubes to one single pull tube so that we could appropriately assign individual tubes to a pool tube. And lastly, the individual to pooling, which was something that we hadn't initially fully planned for. Once the university decided that everyone was coming back to campus, we needed to scale up our testing. And doing individual to pooling would be a very efficient way of being able to do that. So this part of this was that we needed a solution to be able to track all of these samples. And I've already touched upon a lot of this in these previous sections. But again, it was very critical that we were able to change up parts of our workflow to accommodate creating these pooled samples. So to provide just a overview and also some perspective, from 2020 to present day, we tested 45,000 individuals on campus. And at individual sample testing, we tested 6,000 samples per day with individual sample testing. Once we went to pooling, we tested 9,000 samples per day with pooling. And up until now, which is present day, we've tested 2,345,000 total samples. And all of this to say that we had an amazing group of individuals who were able to work together to put this together. And also we had a great system to work with in order to get this clinical testing lab up and running. I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and I'd be happy to answer any questions in the QA following after this presentation.
Thanks so much for your presentation, Z and Lena. Now it's time for our live Q&A. To ask a question, just type it in where it says questions and then press submit. And I see we already have a few questions that have come in, so perhaps we can get started with those. All right. So, Lena, in your digital workflow, what were critical integrations that you needed to connect multiple applications or systems together?
That's a really good question, actually. I think Sherry would be a good person to answer this one.
Awesome.
Sherry?
Yep, sure, I'll answer that. So first of all, we had to integrate with our EMRs. So we had to make sure that we could send COVID test orders and receive results to Enterprise Health. That's what we're using for our occupational health EMR and for our on-prem point-and-click solution for our students. I think it's worth mentioning, well, one thing that made this tricky is we were in the middle of implementing Enterprise Health, our OC Health solution. So it's not like it was well established and we just had to do this. So we had a lot of things in play, but that was critical to get that working. And then the other thing was laying down the infrastructure so that the robots could interact with eLab Next and send the results that they were from the files they were creating. So that was a really big piece. So we had like these two big pieces, like sending orders and results, but then also talking to the equipment. So those were our challenges.
Yeah, that's a great point. Would anyone else like to add anything to that question?
I think that was a great answer, Sherry. I think that covered everything.
Awesome. All right. Someone else was wondering, when it comes to creating an integration with third-party add-ons, databases, and software, how do you tackle such a project?
I could answer that. So for this, because it was all happening so fast, we did have to let go a lot of our typical procedures and protocols so that we could get this done within this time frame. And we did have basically 3 different groups, one working on the student EMR, one working on the employee EMR, and then one for the testing lab, so that it was like these 3 pieces kind of working together. But then we also did contract out with expertise in terms of HL7 integrations to assist us to kind of help us get through things a little faster, again, because of our timeline. And then I know Lena, the lab leveraged their developer for the Node.js code that they wrote in terms of the processing of the files. And then we leveraged the client technology engineer group to work with your developer in terms of the PowerShell scripts that they both worked on together to manage the processing of the files coming from the robots, in terms of just knowing when a file was ready to be processed, picking up the file, processing, making the integration calls to eLab Journal, and then in terms of error handling, putting it in an error folder and sending out notifications. So we had this is our approach in terms of tackling all of this.
Yeah, that's great. Perfect. All right. Another audience member asks, how did the implementation of eLab Next into the BU clinical testing laboratory accelerate your ability to integrate automation or new technologies as needed for different testing needs?
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. So this question is pretty loaded. I think some of it was covered in our presentation. But I think the important thing was that really finding a solution that could handle all of the different parts we were putting together in a very short time frame was what we were looking for. And eLab Next, even like at our, when we had to make the decision to pick a system to work with, we had a very short period of time to assess what was our options. eLab Next definitely stood out. It had customizable features that we were really looking for that weren't available in other solutions. I think that's what I think was the most important part and very challenging for us in terms of finding a solution that could handle that.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right. How did you manage the storage and organization of the samples processed in the lab? I know that you mentioned you processed tons and tons of samples, which seems hard to keep track of.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of just the electronic aspects of being able to track everything, it was critical, and we had touched upon how much information was in the lab. I think Lynn can talk a bit more about just the day-to-day and what that looked like for storage and organization with all of the staff working in the clinical testing lab.
Thanks, Lena. Yeah, this is a very important point because one of the things you have to realize is this lab was being run from 7 a.m. in the morning till 10:30 at night, and there were 7 days a week with different shifts. So we had to have clear tracking of samples because there was handoff in the middle of the day when samples were already in process. So one of the things is every tube was tracked from the minute it was actually collected at the collection site till it was done. And one of the things we were doing, for example, is when you think about running 5,000 to 10,000 samples a day, the majority of those samples, thank goodness, were negatives. And there was a small, although at times a lot more, positive samples. And so we were tracking, so the tubes, when they went on, as Lena showed you, they'd go onto that first robot to be aliquoted into 96 well plates. Then those tubes actually got scanned back into eLabs and put into boxes in the lab. So we knew where every sample was that had come into the lab. And they would stay in those boxes all the way through till the end when we would identify the positive samples. And then we wanted to keep those positive samples for other studies. So we actually have every positive that was ever generated at BU. And they're all sitting in -80 freezers, frozen. But what was important too is those samples were used for other projects. For example, one of the things that we implemented at BU was we wanted to do sequencing of every positive that came through for a couple of reasons. One was for variant detection. As most of you are aware, there were different variants at different times. And it was also very useful for our contact tracing, which could be another whole presentation of how BU used contact tracing within the university to keep the number of positives down. And so those positives, we partnered for sequencing with the NEEDLE, which is the National Emerging and Infectious Disease Laboratory here at BU, who actually sequenced all of our positives as well, because we know where they are in the freezer. And back to the tracking again, as someone who's running the lab, having everything digitally tracked was very helpful, because it could be, at 9 at night, I could get contacted. Did anybody know where sample X was? And I could go into this web base and quickly pull up and report back, oh, it's already been run, or it's in the middle. So it was essential. So yes, all of these sample tracking, there's no way anyone could have tracked these manually.
Wow, great. That's mind-blowing. Let's see. So another sample-related question that came in, someone was wondering, how do you maintain quality control? And were the same, well, you just answered this, but asking about what other things the samples were used for.
I just want to touch upon actually what Lynn had just said, and I think Z wanted to chime in as well. Just everything that Lynn had mentioned really is a part of like what the challenges were. We were like a research group who had to scale up so quickly to make a clinical testing lab for an entire university. So error handling was critical to us, and just reducing paper, managing paper, physical paper was what we wanted to avoid, because that was bound for like errors and mistakes. So having like all the tracking process, everything Lynn had just mentioned, really helped us scope down all of those errors to almost none in most cases. And if we ever had something we needed to backtrack or check on, we had processes in place that we can check samples and rerun samples if we had to. Lynn, we had a great process for that in the lab, right?
Yes, we did. And also just remember, this is a CLIA regulated lab. So, and basically we get inspected. We have to be able to show that we can show chain of custody of a sample all the way through. And doing that digitally, I have to say the regulators were very positive on when they come in and looked at what we were doing, because they felt comfortable that we did have control. And that's a quality control as well, because if something happened that we had to go in and investigate, we could determine through all this digital where the sample was, who actually processed the sample, which piece of equipment it was processed on, which was all really important if we had to do any troubleshooting at all. See?
Right. Yeah. No, I just wanted to add to that to kind of connect all of the dots of the story. This really ties in with that accessibility component of the initial slide. You know, if we looked at how everything was done, and in the last slide we saw that there was millions of data sets, and now you're looking at, okay, maybe there was a human error, maybe there was some kind of a problem that appeared in the lab. It's impossible to be able to know where that sample was stored, who stored it, where it was there a sticky note on it, was there a marker on it, and with this digital solution that we were able to provide, and this ecosystem that BU was able to create, it was just a click away to be able to find these things, correct the course, and be able to move on. And I just wanted to connect the dots for the listeners to see how this was all done.
Yeah, it's really hard to capture in just this like conversation in this Q&A session just how large of an effort it was and how well integrated everything is. It's amazing. We were able to train people very quickly on the system, not just on the robotics side, but also with eLab Next. Everyone is able to get this up and running. So just referring back to the timeline, we had to be up and running within 3 months. And it was scaled up to 5,000 samples after a short pilot study. And yes, there was some small pain points that we had to push through and make changes for, but overall, there was no large hiccups where we had to stop testing or anything. We had such a good integrated system. And I think this answers the question, right, Nikki, that was just answered. I had kind of like moved it back a little bit there.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is, they're all kind of related to each other in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so you have a good system, and then it, affects your quality control and your organization and all the other things that we've been talking about.
Definitely. There was no you couldn't detach any of these single aspects because it was an entire workflow.
Yeah, definitely. Another question that popped up that I think is pretty interesting is about kind of making the lab sustainable while minimizing error for processing the samples. How did you approach that?
I think this might be a good question for Lynn, because not only did we make the lab sustainable in terms of like it's able to process these samples daily with no major hiccups, but also we were able to go to pooling. Lynn, do you want to comment on that?
Yes. So that was in the middle. If you can picture, we were approaching the summer of 2021 and going, okay, this is running very efficiently. But now BU has announced that everybody's coming back to campus. So instead of having maybe 10,000 people on campus, we were going to be back to 45. We were going to have 45,000 on campus. And logistically, we were figuring out, what do we do? Do we go to running overnight? What are we going to do? So thankfully, working with eLab, we sat down and between the two of us, BU and eLab, said, okay, if we were to do pooling, and our pooling in the lab was, we were still collecting individual samples from people, but we were actually pooling them into groups of 5 in the lab. The reason for that is we didn't want to have to run samples and then go back and collect samples from people again. We wanted them in the lab. So we were able to come up with a very efficient system. I think within a few weeks, we had it all designed so that we would have parents, who is the parent pool that we put 5 individual samples into, that could then run through the entire process like we had been running individual samples. At the end, though, we would now get results of a pool. And from those pools, some pools would be negative. So that was fine. We knew all 5 people in there were negative. If a pool was positive, because of this elaborate and efficient system of tracking samples, we could immediately, like within 10 minutes of that run finishing, a tech in the lab could pull off what 5 individual samples went into that pool, go find them in the box they were scanned into, pull them out so we could run them individually, and then within a number of hours get the result of determining who of that in that 5 pool was positive. And that was amazing how quickly we adapted over to that process. Z, I don't know if you want to comment, but it was quick that we did this.
Yeah, no, I think you gave a great summary of that. I guess from a technical perspective, I would just mention maybe that's also related to one of the previous questions about, how do you tackle an integration? How do you tackle a customization? And it was really kind of like a 1 to 2 meeting discussion where we try to understand, okay, what is the end goal? What are the ideal ways for you to get to that goal? And we put on our devil's advocate hats on, and we say, okay, what are all of the problems that we could face in doing this? And we put that on the board. We look at it. We tackle each thing one by one, and then from that discussion, amazing ideas are born. And then we're able to look at that and then be able to execute from a technical perspective. And I think that was really the deciding factor, where we kind of looked at this situation that's happening in the world, and we're all kind of suffering from that. And we had this a collaborative culture that was formed, and we looked at it. Okay, let's figure out how to solve the problem on a technical level, on a human behavioral aspect as well, what people do in the lab, and then just tackle it and create these customizations as needed. And like Lynn said, it took us just a couple of weeks to be able to adapt, and that was a special moment for sure.
Oh, sorry, Lynn, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, Z, you just brought to mind that one of the things that is nice about this digital as well is often in the lab, the lab staff would be saying to me, Lynn, this is such a pain point. This is like, we're doing this and it's really a pain point. And so we would talk to eLab and say, is there something we can do to help the lab out? For example, if you think about it, 5,000 samples a day come in, get scanned, have to get scanned into boxes. And we found we would work with eLab and they would say, well, what is the problem you're having or the challenge? It's not a problem, it's just that it's painful. And we would find solutions together to be able to do that. And that's the flexibility of eLabs that helped us do that.
I just wanted to add real quick to what Z and Lynn had explained, which was that the 3 kind of technical aspects that we used and leveraged was the meta fields, sample types, and the APIs.
Right.
I don't think our system would work with eLab's APIs that are very easily integratable. We're able to leverage them to grab and send data appropriately based on the automation and our results. Sherry, do you want to comment on that and some of the HL7 integration we had to do?
Well, eLab Journal definitely made it easy in terms of that, leveraging the APIs. You're right. It was one of the deciding factors, knowing how easy that would be to integrate, how easy it would be in terms of your developer being able to spin up some code and test that out and make sure those integrations can happen. And in terms of also the messaging that came back from those APIs in terms of how we could leverage that to help us out with understanding when there was an issue and troubleshoot. So all of that was key in terms of making this go quickly and seamlessly and over the course of the whole COVID testing, like sustainable, and if something came up, how we could tap into those APIs to see what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there was something else, Lena, you wanted me to talk about in terms of those, but
that's great, Sherry.
I do feel like leveraging those APIs as quickly as we could was key to all of this.
Absolutely.
Right. I think we have time for a few more. Someone was wondering, with the EMR integration, was HIPAA compliance an issue that you needed to overcome?
Sure, I can take that one. So as a CLIA lab, we did have to be very careful with data. What is nice is that you saw that there's the collection site where the data comes in, and then at the end, the data goes back out to the EMRs. Within the lab, everything is barcoded. There is never a name associated with a sample. There's never any way for anyone in the lab to know who the samples are. Even to the point in the lab, they'd be running their own samples, didn't know which tube was their own samples. And so it really allowed careful protection of the samples. So on the data collection side, that data goes into the EMR. That's where it's connected to people. And on the other end, So the lab itself functioned like many CLIA labs do, where the people in the lab have no access to any of knowing who the data is or any way for the data to come out. In addition, eLab was very controlled who had access to even eLab. So different levels of people within the lab have different access. I had top level as running it, but then a lab technologist would have what they needed to run, but they would not be able to look at any of the connections, if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think on top of that, there's a little bit of, I think it would be great to talk about how secure those API connections were and how that data was transferred. Sherry, do you want to just touch on that real quick?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we definitely used a restricted use server so that all of this would be locked down. I mean, that was the key. It was restricted use. Nothing was, we had firewalls. There was nothing, you couldn't get to it.
Z, do you want to comment on eLab Next as
Yeah, actually, I think it wouldn't hurt to also talk about, again, from a technical perspective of maybe even the integrity of the APIs and being able to put throttle limits on some of the things. So if somebody is trying to customize something, is trying to access the data, this does not interfere with everything else that's going on in the operations. Because if you have 15, 20 people in the lab updating sample information, moving things around, while at the same time there are API calls that are pushing data back and forth between different systems and instruments, that's a lot of pressure on the system. And some of the calls can parse through millions of data sets to do things. So we had to make sure that these things are stable, these things are secure, and it's something that will not interfere with the overall workflow in the lab. So I guess that is also somewhat related to HIPAA and GDPR compliance, GXP compliance, because we only, when these discussions happen, a lot of times people only look at, okay, does it have a feature of signing an experiment, or does it have an audit trail? And I think that's a very limited view of a digital solution, of what it can provide and stay compliant. There's a lot of other things at play that also need to be interconnected into this discussion. And I think from a technical perspective, I think that was also accomplished.
Fantastic. Right. I think we have time for just one more. Someone said, Z, in your presentation, you described the ability to perform some data analysis in real time. Could you expand on that? Is this something that's already integrated in eLab, or is it under development? And how will ChatGPT integrate with the data analysis?
Oh, this is a great question. So this is a general answer, because I don't think Boston University did used any of these like integrations to do these analyses, except just being able to review and access data and do more human analysis of things. But the answer to that question is we most definitely do already have some of these AI and machine learning data analysis features. One of my personal favorites is called Modicus Prime, that does image analysis, where you can feed thousands of images into the platform. It will be able to review everything and analyze and give you the results in just a couple of hours, where we know that there's a lot of PhDs out there that have spent their whole PhD, about 3 to 4 years, to do that same thing. Now it's being done within a couple of hours. I mean, this is incredible. Then we have features like multi-omics analysis and single cell analysis and things like that. And we're continuously adding more of these things. And when I mentioned ChatGPT, that really made this conversation a bit more mainstream. Whereas before, if you brought up AI in biopharma and biotech, it was something that looked at, oh, that's in the future. that we will not be dealing with this. There's all these different concerns and worries, but now we see that artificial intelligence is not your ex machina kind of a thing. It's actually a very a basic algorithm to start with, where it's simply can strip information and do predictive modeling and figure things out and give you summaries and dashboards and help you to figure things out at a much faster pace. So with regards to ChatGPT, I cannot accept or deny the possibility of an integration with ChatGPT or ChatGPT like other systems that are out there. All I can say is that there are a lot of great companies out there that we're in touch with and communicating with, and I'm personally very excited about this. I actually recently took a course at MIT about AI in biopharma and biotech, and that opened the door to many more other organizations and the possibilities of AI in biotech. So to whoever asked that question, I will make sure to follow up with you and then send you more details on that.
Great. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up, since unfortunately that's all the time we have for today. But thank you again so much, Lena, Sherry, Lynn, and Z, for being here with us and for your presentations today. And of course, a big thank you to the audience. We really appreciate you joining us. Please remember that you can watch this webcast again at any time at nature.com webcasts, and we hope you'll join us again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.